Welcome. You're watching Middle East Now on I24 News. Our headlines this hour. Egypt's top general surprise visit to the border with Gaza amid rising tensions over the Philadelphia corridor. A known Islamist opens fire at the Israeli consulate in Munich 52 years after Palestinian terrorists slaughtered the Israeli Olympic team. And Bahrain's King Hamad pardons 450 prisoners as the country marks the 25th year of his rule. First, Egypt's army chief made a surprise visit to the Egypt-Gaza border earlier today. This amid mounting tensions over Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's insistence on holding onto the Philadelphia corridor in any future hostage deal with Hamas. Well, with me in the studio this hour, Benjamin Anthony is the CEO of the Miriam Institute. Great to have you with us, Benjamin. We're also joined by our Middle East correspondent, Ariel Ossaran. Thank you for being with us, Ariel, as well. So, Ariel, take us through this visit then, a surprise visit, as I say, by General Khalifa, right up to the border with Gaza. What can we read into that visit?
Well, the Egyptians are presenting this as an unplanned visit, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that was the case. What we're seeing here is an Egyptian attempt to bolster their posture along the Egypt-Gaza border, saying that they have full control 24/7 over everything that happens. In the visit, Lieutenant General Ahmed Khalifa visiting the Egyptian side of the Philadelphia corridor, also the camera surveillance room that is supposed to give the eyes that really follow, as they claim, 24/7 everything that goes along the border. Obviously, we know that the timing of this visit isn't by chance. It comes as the negotiations are pretty much stuck with one of the main sticking points, Israel's presence, military presence on the Philadelphia corridor. Now, with these latest statements coming out of Israel indicating a potential willingness to reduce forces or to completely withdraw from the area in the second phase, we see here an Egyptian attempt to really show that they have a handle over things, that they're in charge. Obviously, an attempt to try and undermine Israeli claims or even accusations against Egypt, saying that all the smuggling that has been happening over and below the Philadelphia corridor through tunnels and also in the Rafah border crossing have happened under their watchful eye. And so this Egyptian attempt to try and show that they have the control over things.
The Egyptians, of course, deny the existence of those.
Of a single tunnel that crosses.
So
a single tunnel. They've all been destroyed.
And very quickly, Ariel, we have had a response from Hamas today to Netanyahu's insistence that he won't give up the Philadelphia corridor.
Yeah, Hamas reiterating their refusal for any compromise regarding Philadelphia corridor or anything like that. Deputy Hamas leader in Gaza, Khalil al-Haya, and also the chief negotiator, issuing a video statement reiterating Hamas's key demands. Let's take a listen.
Any agreement must include a complete end to the aggression of the occupation on the Palestinian people and a full withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, including the Philadelphia corridor and the Rafah border crossing, and the return of displaced to their homes in a free and undisturbed manner without any inspection.
OK, then we can hear that Hamas official speaking earlier. So, Benjamin, let's step back a bit, because the Prime Minister has now insisted in two separate press conferences, one in Hebrew, one in English. He also gave an interview on American television today saying whatever happens, he's not going to relinquish control of the Philadelphia corridor. Now, that has created problems clearly here in Israel, which we'll talk about in a moment. But it is also starting to really infuriate Israel's allies, not just the United States, but Egypt essentially as well, and Jordan.
So we might have a peace accord with the Egyptians, and we're grateful for that, but they're not without blame for what occurred on October the 7th. If I was able to influence the relevant people, I'd call the bluff of the Egyptians and of the Chief of Staff. I'd push it a little bit. The fact is that we're in Philadelphia, at the corridor, at the Rafah crossing. We've sacrificed the lives of our soldiers. We've sacrificed the limbs of our soldiers. And we've done all of that precisely because the Egyptian military failed to police and enforce that border. And as a consequence of that, Hamas terrorists went out of Gaza, through the Sinai Peninsula, up to Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and then Iran, then back again, and then launched this horrific attack on October the 7th. I don't think that there's any situation in which the IDF should relinquish control over that border. Now, I'm talking about in the long term. If we're able to do something that brings the hostages back, that's a separate issue. But over the long term, the Israel Defense Forces is going to have to be present along the Philadelphia corridor. It's common sense, and as I say, I would push that a little bit and I'd test his resolve.
What about Netanyahu's argument then that if you leave the Philadelphia corridor, there's absolutely no guarantees that the IDF will be able to go back there?
I agree with him. I agree with Prime Minister Netanyahu. I think that he's right that there are no guarantees. If there was some analysis of timing, what I would encourage people to keep in mind is that there is an election coming up in the United States of America. I think that there might be an opportunity for a withdrawal and then a return to that area during the lame duck period between November and January. That would give us room to maneuver. We've seen the IDF do that in Gaza in previous occasions. For example, 2008, 2009, we operated inside the Gaza Strip during Operation Cast Lead, and then we withdrew 2 days before President Obama took office. So we might have some timing and room for manoeuvre there, but long term, we need to be at the Philadelphia corridor.
All right, thank you both. Well, the IDF has today released further details about the location of where the 6 hostages who were murdered by Hamas were found. In a new video, the army shows the entrance to a tunnel in a brightly decorated child's bedroom. Our senior correspondent Bianca Zanini has this report.
Colourful stickers on the wall and a tunnel of death under the floor. The video released by the IDF showing the entrance to the tunnel in southern Gaza, where the bodies of 6 Israeli hostages were recovered late last week.
As you can see, this tunnel was hidden in a child's bedroom, a place where a child should be safe, and not used as a human shield for Hamas. This is exactly what Hamas does. They hide behind civilian population, putting them at risk. From this tunnel, we rescued the bodies of 6 Israeli hostages: Eden Ori, Carmel, Almog, Irsh, and Alexander.
The death of the hostages, who were killed by Hamas shortly before Israeli troops reached them, caused outrage and anger among an already frustrated Israeli population. For the 4th consecutive night, and after months of near-daily protests, demonstrators took to the streets once again Wednesday, demanding that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu reach a ceasefire for hostages deal with Hamas.
It shocked me what happened on Sunday when they found all the 6 bodies who were actively murdered by Hamas, and that Netanyahu let this happen by any chance. And the fact that Netanyahu has basically showed no remorse ever since is just despicable, and it makes me ashamed to be in the same place that he is.
But despite public pressure for a deal, Netanyahu stands firm, saying he will.
All right, we seem to have a little bit of a technical issue with that report, but you get the idea. People here in Israel, many people anyway, are very angry and are taking to the streets once again tonight for the 4th night in a row. And the cousin of one of the 6 murdered hostages, that's Carmel Gat, is among those marching in Tel Aviv tonight, calling on the Prime Minister yet again to do more to secure a hostage deal. We'll go down to Tel Aviv in a moment, where our correspondent Robert Swift is standing by. But Benjamin, looking back at what we've seen this week, you know, people are clearly very, very upset, very angry, and there is this sense that the Prime Minister is just not going far enough. He's not doing enough to try and get a hostage deal, and that was underscored by a comment by the US President Joe Biden earlier this week as well. I mean, is that criticism justified?
I think that Joe Biden's criticism of Benjamin Netanyahu was not helpful at all. I'd like to see the Americans apply just a scintilla of the pressure that they're applying to Israel on the Egyptians, for example, in the case of Philadelphia, in the case of absorbing the Gazans, in the case of them pressing Hamas more seriously. I'm not seeing that coming out of the US administration. That's very, very regrettable. But of course, people are very upset. Everybody's heart is torn asunder when we learn about the rescue of 6 hostages, at least 3 of whom were very, very close to being released in the event of any hostage deal. And this is a country that has been in mourning since October the 7th. That's going to continue and endure. But I do want everybody to remember who's on the other side of this negotiation. It's Yahya Sinwar, who was released by Netanyahu in the deal to bring Gilad Shalit home. And Sinwar, back in 2018, was urging Gazans to storm the fence into the state of Israel and to tear out the hearts of the Israelis. That, to me, does not seem to be a reliable negotiating partner. I think that to think that he is merely wishful thinking, unfortunately.
You don't think they're interested in a deal at all?
I don't think that you can take this individual at his word. I think that there has now been a reassessment of some of the terms. For example, there was an idea that for every scout from the military, female scout from the military that was returned, they would have 30 murderers released back into the Gaza Strip. Israel agreed to that term, and then, upon receiving Israel's agreement, Hamas decided that it would have to review that term and actually raise the price. So these are not people negotiating in good faith.
OK, all right. Thank you, Benjamin. Well, we can go down to central Tel Aviv now. Our Robert Swift is there with the protesters. And Rob, very painful symbolism tonight. We understand that some of the families of the hostages who were murdered last week are carrying mock coffins through the streets of Tel Aviv tonight.
That's right, 27 of them, 27 mock coffins draped in the Israeli flag have just been carried through the streets of Tel Aviv from Habima Square to here. We're in front of the IDF's HQ. You might be able to see the flags in the background. That's one of the front gates of the base. And we've marched here under a fairly heavy police presence. The march started out with several speeches by family members of the hostages, including Gil Dickman, who gave a very impassioned, very harsh speech, which was extremely critical of the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, as well as the wider coalition, the Israeli government. Essentially, the gist of that, backed up by the crowd, was that the Israeli government has sacrificed the lives of the hostages in order to maintain the continuation of the war and the presence in the Philadelphia corridor. Now, the Israeli government says that that is necessary for the security of Israel. But from what we could see from those speeches and from the reaction of the crowd here today, they weren't buying any of that. Now, the Hostages Families Forum has spoken in recent days regarding the fact that it sees the Prime Minister's repeated references to the Philadelphia corridor, that they see that as nothing more than spin, an excuse to continue the IDF's operations in the Gaza for the Prime Minister's personal political benefit. Obviously, this is something that the Prime Minister and his allies have fiercely rejected, but those here in this crowd seem pretty hard and fast in their belief that that is what is motivating the continuation of Israel's operations inside Gaza.
All right, well, thank you very much. Robert Swift, they're down in Tel Aviv with some of the families of the hostages, and Aaron Osteran and Benjamin Anthony with me in the studio. We're getting a bit more of a positive tone from the Biden administration. We heard from the US Ambassador to Israel, Jack Lew, today. He made some comments. He says that the talks are not stalled, that they are still ongoing, and that there are just a few details to work out. But we have heard this so many times before, haven't we?
They're ongoing, but not formally. That's according to the latest statement from the White House. There are working level meetings still ongoing, because I think the Americans understand that if the candle blows out, it'll be very hard to relight it, to rekindle and reestablish the momentum. Now, the latest reporting coming out of Israel is that there is, following the gap bridging proposal, which was the proposal we were talking about in the negotiations up until last week, now there's this a new, or perhaps a proposal to bridge the gaps in the bridging proposal. According to that, there's a possibility of Israel reducing its forces west of the Rafah crossing, but keeping it east along the Philadelphia corridor, trying to find ways to really overcome the last two remaining main obstacles, which are the Philadelphia-Netzarim corridors and the identities and numbers of the Palestinian prisoners who will be released in this negotiation. So the Americans are trying to not just kick the can down the road, but really keep the candle alive. But as far as positive momentum is going, we're not seeing that, at least not publicly.
And of course, the number of Gazan civilians who would be allowed to return to the north of the Gaza Strip, I understand, is a bit of an issue as well. And Benjamin, just real quickly, where are we with the polls? What do the Israeli people want? How much are they willing to prepare to pay? Would they agree to ending the war completely in order to get some of the hostages home?
I don't know that the Israeli people are necessarily weighing in on whether they would end the war completely. That doesn't seem to be a consensus point. There is consensus around bringing the hostages home and doing so as swiftly as possible, but the rhetoric of bring them home now is not aligned with reality. Again, we've got this bad faith negotiator on the other side. We've got a murderous jihadist organisation there in the form of Hamas. Demanding that they come home now is not really aligned with what's on the table at this moment. And we should also be very, very deliberate about ensuring that we pass out and separate between the hostage families whose views are not up for judgment or recrimination at the hands of anybody, and the protest movement, which I actually think is guilty of politicising the plight of the hostage families to some degree and extent. To move forward with the idea that if somebody on the Israeli side simply says yes to every demand of Hamas, we will then get all of the hostages back, is to present them with false hope. I also want to make one mention. There are other families of hostage members who do not support the current deal on the table because their loved ones who are in captivity are men of age and will not be released in the first phase of a deal, and therefore they do not believe a second phase will ever come about. Thus, they oppose the deal as it currently is. They want everyone out in one go or no deal. So there are different views here. Very,
very difficult decisions to be made. All right, thank you both. Well, Israel's Defence Minister Yoav Gallant says the IDF is determined to pull out the roots of terror in the West Bank as intense battles continue between IDF troops and Hamas and Islamic Jihad terrorists. There's more in this report.
Quote, "Mowing the lawn is how Israel Defence Minister Yoav Gallant described the IDF's activities in its West Bank operation dubbed Summer Camp as it reaches its 9th day. Speaking on Wednesday, Gallant added that in order to prevent terror, its roots would eventually need to be pulled too.
The resurgence of car bombs in the West Bank and also inside Israel, and the continuation of this, of shooting everywhere, these are things that need to be brought to an end.
The ongoing major terror operation in the West Bank began at the end of August with raids on Jenin, Tulkarem, and the Farah camp near Tubas. Its goal being dismantling Iran-backed Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad terror networks. So far, more than 30 terrorists have been eliminated, including the son of notorious terrorist Zakaria Zubeidi and other gunmen in a drone strike early Thursday morning in the city of Tubas. Gallant ordered these targeted airstrikes by the Israeli Air Force in places where he believed there was a threat to soldiers. The IDF has said it is working to uncover explosive devices planted along the roads and has subsequently released footage of the demolition of a bomb-making lab, as well as the neutralization of bombs and explosive devices. The fighting forcing residents to huddle in their homes, only emerging for necessities.
The situation in the areas which are under siege is bad. The Israeli army is preventing food, water, ambulances, and journalists from reaching these besieged areas.
Israeli military officials says an operation of this scale is necessary to curb recent attacks against Israeli civilians that have become more sophisticated and deadly.
And I think we have some live pictures coming to us now from the Palestinian city of Jenin in the West Bank. There you can see that has been one of the scenes of these battles between IDF troops and terrorists belonging either to Hamas or to Islamic Jihad. Looks like pretty quiet on the streets now, but there have been very fierce battles raging there and elsewhere over the past 9 days. Ariel, is the IDF getting a handle on the very volatile situation there, or is this just going to be endless war?
I don't know if anyone can say that the IDF has a handle on the security situation in the West Bank, but it's trying. It's trying. It has been trying since for the past 2 years now, 3 years intensively, but that intensity has obviously amplified since October 7th. The understanding is that with Hamas limited in what military capabilities it can execute against Israel in the Gaza Strip, so it's trying to export that from the West Bank. the threat from the West Bank is a lot more challenging than the threat from Gaza. Also, the close proximity between Jewish and Palestinian communities in the West Bank, but also the West Bank seen as the underbelly of Israel, given its close proximity also to the Israel's center of population. And so this operation, we've seen many operations in Jenin and also large-scale operations, as the IDF is presenting this latest one in Jenin, in the northern part of the West Bank, to try and uproot the existing terror cells there. But given that we've seen this last year, with the goal being to put away the threat coming from Jenin years ahead, we see the following year the IDF back in there in an even larger operation. So this is an illustration as to how big this threat is, but also how much effort Hamas is exerting to try and inflame the West Bank and to bring upon this new, to amplify the threat of explosive devices in the West Bank, but obviously also trying to export that to city centers, Tel Aviv, and so forth.
And thank you, Ariel. And Benjamin, for some people, the situation in the West Bank is much more worrying, much more troubling than what we're seeing in Gaza, which at least is sealed off from the rest of Israel. But there is no border. There is a very porous border. Talk about communities all around Israeli towns and cities across the area. And there are weapons, which the Foreign Minister put his finger on last minute, flowing in across the border from Iran via Jordan into the West Bank. I mean, what can be done about this long term?
Well, firstly, from those areas where the IDF is operating, you have major infrastructure within Israel, within the range of shoulder-mounted weapons, even sniper rifles. For example, the highway number 6 would be within range if the IDF was not there for terror attacks. Ben Gurion Airport would be within range if the IDF was not there in order to prevent these terror attacks. But I think that this shows a great deal about the Palestinian Arabs and who they actually are and what their mindset is. A lot of people excuse what's going on with the Gazan population because they claim that they are under the jackboot of Hamas, Hamas being the ruling regime there. That's not the case in Judea and Samaria. Hamas is not the ruling regime inside Judea and Samaria, and yet here we see the need for the IDF to undertake the broadest counter-terror operation since Operation Defensive Shield, that goes all the way back to 2001, 2002, that was a response to the Second Intifada, and it's against this rise of terror inside Judea and Samaria.
Is the current government guilty of not doing enough to rein in some of the violence from the Israeli settlers in the West Bank? Is that making the situation worse?
No, I don't think it's making the situation worse. I don't think that the routing of towns is excusable or can be in any way countenanced here in Israel. But with that having been said, I think that it's a reaction to the fact that terror inside Judea and Samaria has not come to an end, and too many Israelis now understandably see Palestinian Arabs as their enemies. What we need to do is quell the terror, bring about calm, and I think that the IDF is the only force that can capably do that. OK,
thank you. Now, Israel's Shin Bet agency says August was the most intense month in terms of attacks from Hezbollah. The Lebanese terrorist group fired more than 1,300 missiles, drones and rockets into Israel that month, including on the 25th, when it fired more than 300 in just one day. Let's go to the north. Our Zach Andrews is there. Zach, what has been happening on the northern front over the past 24 hours?
Hi, Laura. It's a bit quieter considering the attacks that have been taking place over the last few weeks. We have Hezbollah claiming responsibility for 5 attacks at this point in the night. No reports of casualties. We don't see any significant damage as a result of earlier rocket attacks and suspected drones that were fired earlier in the afternoon around 3 p.m. local time. What you just mentioned, that Shin Bet report, over 1,300 rockets that have been fired in the month of August. That's up from July, 1,091 rockets fired in the month of July. This is a considerable uptick. This has been a very hot summer, of course. What that number does not account for is the number of drones that are fired in this total. So the number of rockets, that's a considerable amount of firepower that's been leveled here from southern Lebanon at northern Israel.
Zach, thank you very much. Zach Andrews there up in the north. Now, an 18-year-old opened fire outside the Israeli consulate in the German city of Munich today, 52 years to the day after Palestinian terrorists massacred the Israeli Olympic team. The suspect was reportedly known to Austrian authorities as an Islamist. More in this report.
52 years later, and it seems like the Israeli victims of the Munich massacre in 1972 still can't rest in peace. On the Memorial Day marking the assassination of 11 Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympic Games, German policemen shot and killed an armed man in the area of the Israeli consulate in Munich.
Around 9 a.m., a person was sighted who handled a long weapon. Police officers noticed this. An exchange of fire ensued with this person. We now know that the person died during this exchange of fire. Officers were able to stop the person within this area, and we currently have no information that there could be other people who were injured.
Given the Memorial Day dedicated to the victims of the Munich massacre, the Israeli consulate was closed, but with heightened emotions connected to Israel's war in Gaza, German police took extra precautions.
Special units are currently looking into the area of the perpetrator and a vehicle possibly connected to the perpetrator in order to find out whether there might be any booby traps, but so far, we have not encountered any. The investigation is underway.
Israeli President Isaac Herzog took to X to express shared condemnation and horror with the German President Steinmeier. 52 years ago, the Munich massacre changed how the world thinks of terrorism, and yet, 52 years later, the memory of the victims is also tainted, with 101 hostages still being held in Gaza. At 4:10 a.m. on the 5th of September 1972, members of the Black September terror group, linked to the Palestine Liberation Organization, entered Munich's Olympic Village, armed with rifles and Kalashnikovs. The mission of the group was to hold the Israeli Olympic team hostage in order to demand the release of 236 prisoners. The attack lasted about 20 hours, with the mission failing, but still managing to kill 11 Israeli athletes. With 101 hostages still being held hostage by Hamas in Gaza, it's difficult to ignore the echoes of the past.
All right, before we go to break, Ariel.
Yeah, we've been talking earlier about what needs to be done, what can the solution to stop the smuggling from Jordan. The thing is, that same threat coming from another country that Israel has a peace treaty with, Egypt, and that illustrates that the diplomatic option is not being pursued enough in tandem with the military option. In fact, relations between Israel, Jordan, and Egypt are perhaps at their worst that they ever were. That is one option for the solution.
Israel needs her friends, even if they're not always the best of friends. All right, thank you, Ariel. We're going to take a very short break. Stay with us.
This broadcast is brought to you by Israel Bonds, the most direct and impactful way to support Israel. Invest now at israelbonds.com. This broadcast is brought to you by Israel Bonds, the most direct and impactful way to support Israel. Invest now at israelbonds.com.
Lại phong trào thể dục thể thao trong cộng đồng. Một lần nữa xin được chúc mừng Trung ương.
Welcome back. Now, for the first time in 11 months, the UN Security Council has heard directly about the plight of the Israeli hostages, including the long-term damage done to young children who were freed as part of a deal last November. Our senior correspondent, Bianca Zanini, has more.
The United Nations Security Council is repeating its call for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza.
Allow me to restate that hostages must be released, civilians must be protected, and their essential needs must be met. This Council and all member states must use their influence to ensure compliance, including by exerting diplomatic and other pressure and cooperating in pursuing accountability.
During the meeting, convened at the request of Israel, the Council discussed the issue of the Israeli hostages held in Gaza, which had not been put on the agenda since they were kidnapped on October 7th. Members heard stories of child hostages still held by Hamas.
Children were butchered in their houses, butchered, shot, burned, choked, butchered. It took 50 days and more, 50 days in which young children were kept in captivity, kept in complete silence. They were not allowed to cry, not allowed to laugh, not even allowed to stand up. They hardly ate, kept every bite of bread, moved from place to place in the middle of the night, horrified. When they arrived, they did not look like children. They looked like shadows of children. No impressions on their faces. They were not happy. They were not crying. They were mostly very, very silent. Questions like, are we allowed to look out the window? May I step out of bed? Are we safe here? Were repeatedly asked.
Israel's ambassador to the UN called on the Council to condemn Hamas.
Since October 7th, the Security Council has passed 4 resolutions with no condemnation of Hamas for their crimes. Meanwhile, the General Assembly has passed 2 resolutions. Hamas is never even mentioned in either resolution. They vaguely mention the release of those held captive, but fail to identify the Hamas monsters who took them.
The 6 hostages killed this weekend were executed at the same time negotiators were discussing the names of individuals to be released in a ceasefire deal, from its massacre of 1,200 people to its weaponization of sexual violence. These latest murders confirm that Hamas is a terrorist organization. I know some members of this council won't acknowledge that, but that's the simple truth.
The Council insisted on also hearing the stories of Palestinian children. The Palestinian representative to the UN used the meeting to accuse Israel of launching a full-fledged war against the Palestinian people.
From genocide to apartheid, Israel is showing the world its willingness and readiness to use the most despicable means to achieve its colonial aims. Dispossession, displacement, devastation, destruction, death. That is what it has been inflicting on Palestinians for decades.
The Israeli ambassador called on the Security Council to reach a resolution.
Well, for more on that, we're joined now by our senior US correspondent, Mike Wagenheim. Good to see you, Mike. And this is, as I mentioned, the first time in 11 months that the UN Security Council has heard in detail about what exactly the hostages have gone through and, of course, are still going through.
Yeah,
the most disturbing thing beyond that fact alone, that was the first official UN Security Council meeting in those 11 months to deal with that issue, was the fact that the Council felt it needed to, quote unquote, balance things out. And they brought on another civil society speaker, the head of B'Tselem, who went on an anti-Israel rant, essentially, blaming Israel and Israelis, Israeli society for October 7th and the aftermath. So even when the hostages are discussed, apparently it must be done in some sort of greater context, according to the members of the Security Council. So this is the dynamic that Danny Danon and the Israeli mission is working under there. There's no resolution that came out of that meeting yesterday. We didn't expect anything would come out of that meeting yesterday in terms of some resolution to recognize the plight of the hostages. And this is kind of the environment that Israel has been dealing with. We did hear more criticism of the U.S.-Israel relationship, especially coming from the Russians, which has been a tactic and a consistent tactic that there's throughout the war here, saying that U.S. and Israel are tied together essentially at the hip, that the U.S. is allowing this war to move forward. Slovenia, which holds the Council presidency for this month, came out yesterday and said if there is not something that comes out of the negotiations and comes out of it pretty quickly here, they're going to use the power of the presidency to try to advance something to force a ceasefire, something that the U.S. certainly would continue to veto, we would imagine, here throughout the next month, even if these negotiations continue to putter along.
And thank you, Mike. And you're at the you're speaking to us tonight from Las Vegas. You're at the Republican Jewish Congress. Tell us about some of the conversations that you've had with Republicans about Middle East policy and about Israel.
Yeah, the Republican Jewish Coalition Summit ongoing here. Former President Donald Trump set to speak via satellite here pretty shortly. We got in a few words earlier today with Senator Joni Ernst from Iowa. She's a prominent member of the Abraham Accords caucus, and we asked her whether in the aftermath of October 7th, because she just came back from the Middle East just a couple days ago. She visited Israel, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Qatar, and other regional stops. We asked her, does she get the feeling after that delegation visit that normalization can move forward? Here's her answer.
The Abraham Accords under President Trump was such an incredible achievement for peace and prosperity in the Middle East and ties to Israel with these Arab nations. Do I think we can proceed with the normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia? Yes, I do. I do have hope that that can occur. But in speaking with the Crown Prince, he did state it's going to go forward, but we just don't know when. And a lot of that will depend upon what happens in the Gaza Strip.
Senator Joni Ernst there, speaking to our very own Mike Wagenheim. Mike, thank you very much indeed. Benjamin Anthony is with me in the studio, and the UN has not really covered itself in glory, has it, when it comes to the plight of the Israeli hostages?
No, the United Nations is a disgraceful organisation at this stage. That was great reporting by Mike Wagenheim, but I do want to pick up on just one point. He mentioned that Slovenia might try to wield its power in order to impose an immediate ceasefire on Israel, and that the United States would certainly veto that. I don't think that that's necessarily the case. I remember well that when Barack Obama was ceding the stage as President of the United States, he abstained on Resolution 2334, which was an egregious resolution against the State of Israel. Now, President Biden is not generally viewed to be of that school of action and activity, but given that we know that he's not at his optimum level of function and those around him take more of an anti-Israel or less of a sympathetic view towards Israel than the president does, we could actually see the United States abstain in the event that there was a resolution brought about. It's happened before, it could happen again, nothing is for certain.
Yeah, Israel has certainly had some unpleasant surprises from its allies in Washington.
Certainly has.
Hasn't it? And Ariel, it has been very frustrating for people here in Israel, hasn't it, to have their case heard by the United Nations, and all of that very much complicated, I think, by the role of UNRWA as the aid agency that delivers funding to the Palestinians, but is also very mixed up with Hamas.
I think Israelis have very little faith in the United Nations, not looking at this, what's supposed to be the global government and any expectation that it will help the situation of Israel in its current war. But I think, and Mike illustrated this, I think the fact that they felt in their first discussion to have to balance it out with the Palestinian side really gives the sense for Israelis that even the legitimate voice or the legitimate airtime, so to speak, that they get isn't Israel isn't worth its own time on the global stage. The fact that you have to balance that out, so to speak, with the Palestinian voice, I think, with all the discussions that were on the plight of the Palestinians, which is real, ongoing, and devastating, that does not negate the fact that Israelis can also get their time at the UN without having to balance it out.
All right, Ariel Osseran, Benjamin Anthony, thank you very much indeed. Goodbye. 12 Syrian soldiers have been killed in a suicide bombing by an al-Qaeda-linked group in the country's northwest. It's the highest such death toll for the Syrian army this year. A fragile ceasefire that was brokered by Russia and Turkey is still largely holding in Idlib province, but armed groups control much of that territory. Well, joining us now, Badakan Ahmad is a Syrian journalist and reporter. Thank you for being with us, Badakan. What exactly happened then in this latest attack?
Well, exactly. This was like the strongest attack by HTS. Well, the biggest number of the Syrian soldiers since 1 year. It's around 12 Syrian soldiers who get killed, and included an officer by HTS. And this was like a part of an escalation by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is linked to Al-Qaeda since Monday. Well, this attack took place exactly in the northern countryside of Latakia, which is considered a sensitive geography to the Syrian regime, the Latakia government, and was governorate, sorry. And this was in the Al-Turkoman mountain, which is not far to the Latakia city itself. Well, this region has been under a ceasefire since March, but 2020. But this is brokered by Russia and Turkey, despite repeated violations. And to talk about where Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is controlling, they control almost half of Idlib and also parts of Aleppo, Hama, and as I mentioned, the northern countryside of Aleppo. Let's talk about more like the last 24 hours that around 27 regime soldiers were killed. One attack was in the Syrian desert that ISIS groups tried to do attack to the Syrian groups' governments, but they avoided the Iranian groups in that territory. Also, the HTS is attempting to boast its image as a defender of the Syrian revolution, an opponent of the reconciliation with the regime in Idlib area.
So this is a huge area, isn't it, Idlib? And you've got millions of people living there. The Syrian regime clearly has no control over the territory. Who's taking care of the day-to-day functioning of this vast territory?
Well, it's, as I mentioned, it's Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS. They're controlling around half of Idlib and also parts of the places that I've mentioned, Hama, Latakia, Aleppo. And besides that, you have also other groups that called the National Army factions. These National Army factions are somehow, some groups of them or some factions of them, they are belonged completely to Turkey or backed by Turkey. But generally, the National Army factions, they are conducting operations to obstruct any potential rapprochements between the Syrian government and Turkey. And in the area which is not under the control of the Syrian government, lives around 5 million people. Most of them, they are refugees from the destroyed places and areas that now it's under the control of the Syrian government. And these civilians or these refugees, they really live in so hard conditions and atmosphere in these areas.
Badakan, thank you very much. We appreciate it. Badakan Ahmad there. Bahrain's king has pardoned over 450 prisoners to mark his 25 years as ruler. One activist said that many political prisoners were among those freed. In the UAE, meanwhile, dozens of Bangladeshis have also been pardoned after they were jailed for staging a rare protest about what was happening in their own country. In Saudi Arabia, 7 people have been arrested for crimes that range from threatening national unity to promoting hatred in society. Officials there say the kingdom stands firmly against anyone trying to undermine national cohesion. Well, to talk more about all of this, we're joined from Dubai by our correspondent, Bastien Bourri. Bastien, let's begin in Bahrain. It is traditional, isn't it, for monarchs to pardon prisoners on big state occasions, but this is an awful lot of people. Do we know why they were jailed in the first place?
Well, many of them were and are dissidents detained during the 2011 crackdown on those Shiite protests, which were part of the Arab Spring, when protests against the ruling Al-Khalifa family swept the country. And last summer, a few detainees had begun refusing food, and increasing numbers had joined since. It had even triggered a rare street protests by relatives of inmates demanding their release. And Bahrain, as you know, is a tiny country, but it has one of the highest incarceration rates per capita in the whole Middle East. So it appears that the authorities have backtracked in a pretty unprecedented way by releasing these prisoners.
All right, let's go to the UAE, because a surprise move there, wasn't it, to pardon dozens of Bangladeshis who had been engaging in protests, not something that is welcomed in the UAE. They weren't protesting about the Emiratis, but what was happening in their own country. Why are they all being released now?
Well, it appears that the Emirati justice has also backtracked. First, because the situation in Bangladesh has improved tremendously, and second, because some surveillance cameras are showing that these demonstrators were less violent than initially claimed. Back then, the police pretended it had warned protesters, ordering them to disperse, to which they had been reportedly unresponsive. And as a result, 57 had been sentenced, all Bangladeshis, including 3 to life imprisonment and 54 to 10 years imprisonment. So, yes, it is a very harsh sentence. It was a very harsh sentence. And it all happened very quickly, between the demonstrations that took place on a Friday, the arrest on the same day, and the verdict just 3 days after the events.
Very different story in Saudi Arabia today. Any more details about those 7 arrests?
Very little information so far, but it seems that this is the aftermath of a much more massive arrest that took place 3 days ago in Saudi Arabia. Some 140 government officials had been arrested on charges of corruption, including bribery, abuse of power, and money laundering. So it could be that the other 7 people arrested today are among them.
Bastien, thank you very much. Bastien Bourri there in Dubai. A new row has erupted between France and Azerbaijan, with Paris warning citizens not to travel to the Turkic nation. France is one of Armenia's strongest supporters. Earlier this year, France accused Azerbaijan of meddling in a pro-independence campaign in its overseas territory of New Caledonia. Well, we will be joined by Dr. Vasif Husseinov in a moment. I'm being told that he's not ready to talk to us yet. So we have this report for you from Libya.
The latest round of tensions in Libya have come about after efforts by political factions to oust the head of the central bank, leaving them locked in a power struggle over control of the bank and the country's oil revenue. It's a mirror of the current imbroglio in Libya, which is split between a UN-recognized government and a rival administration in the east of the country. Libya's central bank is the sole legal repository for Libyan oil revenue, and it pays state salaries across the country, meaning banks, shops, and businesses across Libya have been unable to operate.
We have transactions and payment deadlines with obligations that must be met on time, but the clearing system isn't working. Even transferring funds has become risky.
The impasse began last month when the president of the Tripoli Presidency Council tried to remove the governor of the central bank, Sadiq al-Kabir, and install a rival in his place.
The Libyan government is following with great interest the repeated attacks on the leaders, employees, and administrations of the Central Bank of Libya by an outlaw group. incited and assisted by the impersonator Presidential Council, targeting illegal control over the most important financial institution in the country, which is the Central Bank of Libya.
Eastern factions had vowed to keep oil output shuttered until Sadiq al-Kabir was returned to his post.
The Libyan government declares a state of force majeure on all oil fields, halting oil production and exports until further notice.
On Tuesday, Libya's two legislative bodies, with help from the UN, agreed to appoint a central bank governor, potentially diffusing a battle for control of the country's oil revenue that slashed production. Since then, some oil production has resumed, and in an indication that traders anticipate the most recent agreement will increase oil flow. Prices fell by about 5% to their lowest points in nearly 9 months, but the struggle for power paralyzed Libya's central bank.
Libyan leaders must reach a political settlement based on negotiations and compromise. We cannot allow the aspirations of registered Libyan voters to be overshadowed by the narrow interests of a few.
The country's fragmented political environment is the root of these issues.
Throughout the Middle East, there has been a new wave of boycotts of companies believed to have ties to Israel. Big brands like Coca-Cola, Starbucks and Pepsi-Cola are among those being targeted. Our Fabio Shapiro has this report.
The war on soda has begun in the Middle East, but not because of its harm to health and high amounts of sugar. The multinationals PepsiCo and Coca-Cola are being boycotted due to their relations to the West and Israel.
This is a duty for all of us as an Arab nation, as Muslims, and as any human being who calls for freedom. We must boycott because these companies support the Zionist entity in a big way. And this entity, of course, we saw what they did to our brothers in Gaza.
The campaign started after a Libyan filmmaker made a short movie claiming that the profits generated to the brands would be reverted into investments in the IDF operations in Gaza, something that both companies denied, but it didn't stop young Arabs from joining the movement.
The effect of the current situation in the Middle East, it will have long-term effects for two main reasons. Mainly because this boycott is happening by young people, and they have very, very strong beliefs. And in my opinion, they will not kind of let go of these beliefs very easily. Second reason, it's habitual. Once people switch, it's sometimes very difficult for them to go back to their old habits.
Throughout the Middle East, many local soda brands have risen in sales. V7, Kinza, and Spiros Patis are some of the options in the market, but their higher costs may deter consumers from joining the boycott.
We're all boycotting foreign products and using the Egyptian products. The Egyptian products are good, but the problem is that imported products cost 20 cents, while the Egyptian product costs 30 to 40 cents.
The conspiracy theories targeting the brands have spread around the region since the beginning of the Israel-Hamas war in October. Earlier this year, a Lebanese campaign asked for a Pepsi boycott in the country, claiming the company's logo was an allusion to the Israeli flag. Now, with a strong presence in Israel, both Pepsi and Coca-Cola have a history of boycott against the little country, in fear of bad reactions from Muslim countries. Coke lifted its blockade in the 1960s, opening a factory in Bnei Brak, just east of Tel Aviv, which became an Israeli landmark. Pepsi, on the other hand, took way longer to start its relations. In 1992, the company licensed its beverage brands to the Israeli local company Tempo. Pepsi would later buy the Israeli SodaStream for over $3 billion. While global brands have seen a 4% decrease in the market share in the Middle East, a substantial long-term change seems far from coming to fruition.
Well, we can talk now about that row between France and Azerbaijan. The French are telling their citizens not to travel to Azerbaijan. Joining me now, Dr. Vasif Husseinov is the head of the department at the Air Centre with a focus on Azerbaijan relations in the world. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. So we'll get straight to it then. The French say their citizens could face arrest if they go to Azerbaijan. Is that true?
Yeah, to put it simply, it is not true, but it naturally poses the question why France made such a statement concerning Azerbaijan. First of all, I have to make it clear that it is not the first time Azerbaijan sees such a unfriendly and to some extent hostile moves and statements from the French government. And its history dates back to the Second Karabakh War, which happened in the third half of second half of 2020. At that time, during the Second Karabakh War, Azerbaijan liberated its territories, which were occupied by French ally Armenia. And after the Second Karabakh War, Azerbaijan started to get some attacks from different sources in France, primarily from the French parliament, and recently also from the French government. At that time, France was the first country whose parliament, both chambers of the parliament, almost unanimously recognized so-called Nagorno-Karabakh Republic, which was not even recognized by Armenia itself. And after this event, we started to see increasingly more attacks from the French government against Azerbaijan. So we are not surprised today to see a travel warning by the French Foreign Ministry concerning Azerbaijan.
Okay,
I have to make it clear that it is the only country in Europe that has made such a statement. Azerbaijan has a lot of European
countries. Right, because you're hosting a big climate summit soon, aren't you? So we're running short on time, but so I just want to ask you about Azerbaijan's relations with France not doing so well. What about relations with Israel then? Because the two countries do have a defence and energy partnership, but I'm wondering, given how strained Israel's relationship is now with Turkey, Azerbaijan's strongest ally, is that relationship with Israel being reviewed at all?
Azerbaijan's relations with Israel are very deep and multi-layered, and Azerbaijan has been able so far to strike a balance between different countries when it comes to its foreign policy, its external orientation. Turkey is not the only Muslim country with which Azerbaijan has very strong strategic partnership. Another country is Pakistan. But despite this fact, Azerbaijan has been so far able to maintain very friendly and very close relations with Israel. Israel has been one of the main allies of Azerbaijan when it comes to different security issues, both in the region and in the wider region. So far,
no pressure on Baku.
Negatively affected.
No pressure on Baku from President Erdogan.
No, we have not seen any pressure from the Turkish side, because Turkey also has demonstrated understanding to the fact that Azerbaijan is located in a very precarious geopolitical situation, neighboring on the one hand Russia, on the other hand Iran, and has a territorial conflict with a neighboring country. So under this circumstance, Azerbaijan needs strong allies like Israel, and our Turkish brothers have demonstrated understanding to this critical situation for us.
Dr. Husseinov, a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
That's it for tonight's show. Do stay tuned. The Rundown is next. Good night.
Shalom. ¿Qué me trae por aquí? La necesidad impostergable de 600 millones de hispanoparlantes que ahora necesitan escuchar el mensaje judío e israelí en tiempos difíciles. ¿Cómo lograrlo? Cuento con ustedes para continuar llevando a lo más alto del mundo mediático una inquebrantable diplomacia pública al servicio de la verdad sin concesión alguna.
As the U.S. prepares to present a revised proposal it hopes could finalize a hostage for ceasefire deal, Prime Minister Netanyahu stands firm on Israeli forces remaining in Gaza's Philadelphia corridor. We'll have the latest. It's called Operation Summer Camp, but the IDF's big anti-terror offensive in the West Bank is far from fun and games. We'll take a closer look. The Republican Jewish coalition gathers in Las Vegas as GOP candidates Donald Trump and J.D. Vance hammer Kamala Harris over her support for Israel. We'll go live to our correspondent at the convention. This is the Rundown on I-24 News. I'm Khaled Ben David. The IDF has released a new video showing the entrance to the tunnel where the 6 bodies of Israeli hostages were found late last week. The tunnel shaft was hidden inside a child's bedroom in southern Gaza. In Israel, pressure is growing to reach a ceasefire agreement that will ensure the return of the 101 remaining hostages held by Hamas in Gaza. A U.S. official told reporters that 90% of a deal had been agreed on, and the Biden administration is finalizing a new bridging proposal it hopes will be acceptable to both sides. While the White House said today Hamas is the biggest obstacle to a deal, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made clear again he won't agree to withdraw Israeli troops from the Philadelphia corridor, a key sticking point. Our senior correspondent Bianca Zanini has more.
Colorful stickers on the wall and a tunnel of death under the floor. The video released by the IDF showing the entrance to the tunnel in southern Gaza, where the bodies of 6 Israeli hostages were recovered late last week.
As you can see, this tunnel was hidden in a child's bedroom, a place where a child should be safe, and not used as a human shield for Hamas. This is exactly what Hamas does. They hide behind civilian population, putting them at risk. From this tunnel, we rescued the bodies of 6 Israeli hostages, Eden Ori, Carmel, Almog, Irsh, and Alexander.
The death of the hostages, who were killed by Hamas shortly before Israeli troops reached them, caused outrage and anger among an already frustrated Israeli population. But despite public pressure for a deal, Netanyahu stands firm, saying he will only agree to a deal if it ensures the security of Israel. A sticking point in the negotiations is the presence of Israeli troops on the Philadelphia corridor, the stretch of land on the border between Egypt and Gaza, which has been used to smuggle in weapons to Hamas.
I'm telling you that if we relieve the pressure, if we get out of the Philadelphia corridor, we're not going to get the hostages back. Certainly we're going to condemn a lot of them to stay there. We could get a few out. They'll give us that. But they'll leave a lot with them. We won't have the pressure point, and something else will happen. We will not be able to come back. So we won't release all the hostages, and we won't achieve the defenses that we must have to prevent more October 7th again and again and again.
Any agreement must include a complete end to the aggression of the occupation on the Palestinian people and a full withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, including the Philadelphia corridor and the Rafah border crossing, and the return of displaced to their homes in a free and undisturbed manner, without any inspection.
101 hostages are still being held by Hamas. Meanwhile, in Gaza, the fighting and the suffering continue. But through the destruction, hope finds a way, breaking the silence of the rebels of the war.
Well, hostage families and their supporters marched through Tel Aviv this afternoon, arriving outside IDF headquarters, where our Robert Swift is now. And Robert, let's talk about the events of today as, again, the hostage family supporters trying to keep the pressure up on the government to move forward on a deal.
Yeah, they are indeed, and the level of anger here doesn't seem to have reduced in the last 5 days of protests. I'd say that the numbers here, they're not at the huge scale that we saw at the start of the week on Sunday, but they are bigger than we've seen in the last couple of nights. The number of people here in the street. It started out slightly smaller in Habima Square, but as it's arrived here in front of the IDF headquarters, the numbers do seem to have swollen. The road that we're standing on is closed at both ends by the police who placed trucks to barricade the road. And as you can hear behind me, the protest chants are in full swing. Now, they started off in Habima, where there were several speeches before the 27 mock coffins were carried through the streets. Let's take a listen to now to what Gil Dickman, the cousin of one of the hostages, had to say earlier.
Here are the numbers. 109 hostages freed alive in a deal, 8 hostages rescued in military operations, 27 hostages returned in coffins. Carmel, my cousin, was murdered a week ago. She was taken out to be killed a week ago, abandoned to die by a government that could have freed her. 327 days she was there in Gaza, in captivity. There were 327 opportunities to bring her home, and every one of them was squandered.
Now, the big question is to what extent this pressure here in the streets translates into pressure on the Israeli government. Now, the level of rhetoric, the harshness of the criticism coming from these protests, coming from the hostages' families here against Prime Minister Netanyahu and his government, that's clearly ratcheted up since the deaths of the 6 hostages last week. Now, it does appear that the Prime Minister is reacting to this. We've seen 2 press conferences from him just in the last few days, the first in Hebrew, the second in English. That would imply that the pressure is sensitive to this criticism and that he's sensitive to how it's being perceived abroad. What the outcome of that is, the outcome of the pressure that we're seeing here, that remains to be seen.
Right, Robert. We should point out that polls do show there is some certainly support within Israel, not majority support, but a sizable percentage of the population that is supporting at least the Prime Minister's stance on retaining the Philadelphia corridor. And that does give him some kind of sort of a political foundation to stand on, even though, as you said, internationally, we are seeing some very serious pressure.
That's right, and it's also worth bearing in mind that the polls for Likud, for the Prime Minister's party, they look much better now than they did 6 months ago, than they did 9 months ago. So, in some ways, the direction, the trend, is actually one that supports the Prime Minister's position. Nonetheless, the level of, I would say, the level of politicization from the hostages' families, that does seem to have increased. Where 6 months ago, it was the case that many of the hostages' families were attempting to remain apolitical, and that position has shifted more and more until we've reached the point where we have in the last week, I would say, where many of the hostages' families are openly critical. That, of course, does not necessarily translate into the position of the entire Israeli public.
Right. Of course, again, the murder of those 6 hostages, that was some kind of turning point. I agree with you in terms of the intensity of certainly the hostage families and their supporters there. Robert Swift there, outside IDF headquarters in Tel Aviv at the protest march. Thank you for that. And joining us in studio, Reserves IDF Lieutenant Colonel Doron Avital. He's the former commander of Special Forces, and our Middle East correspondent, Ariel Oseron. And Ariel, the U.S. still trying to find the formula that they think could, even though despite what we heard just now, for example, from both the Prime Minister and a Hamas spokesman, find some kind of formula, bridging formula, that could close the gaps and come out with a deal.
Yeah, so the Americans are trying to find, as you described, a formula to bridge the gaps that still remain in the gap bridging proposal that was discussed up until now. I hope I didn't get that too convoluted, but that is the current situation that the negotiations are in now. We're not talking about discussions at the top level of the main delegations. On the Israeli side, it's not the delegation that we've seen until now, head of Mossad David Barnea or Shin Bet head Ronen Bar, but rather Strategic Affairs Minister Ron Dermer, representing specifically Prime Minister Netanyahu. Now, what is emerging from this gap bridging proposal is basically three main sticking points that still remain. We're talking about the Philadelphia and Netzarim axis, one on the Gaza-Egypt border, that's Philadelphia, Netzarim, that's in the central Gaza Strip, basically splitting Gaza to north and south half. The second is the number of living Israeli hostages to be released and the terms of the release of the Palestinian prisoners. And the third, which is seen as a more technical issue, but it is very important, at least for the Israelis, is the period between the first and second phases. What will happen if the negotiations are still ongoing, and will the fire cease? Specifically on the Philadelphia corridor, these negotiations are, the proposal to bridge the gaps is to split this question into three areas regarding the beach from the sea to the Rafah border crossing, and from the border crossing to the east. The first two, there does seem to be, the latter two, the Rafah border crossing, and from the Rafah border crossing east, there does seem to be agreements between the sides, given that the U.S. is acknowledging that Israel will be able to maintain military presence there because it's not stipulated as a densely populated area, but the area from the Rafah border crossing west to the sea, that is still being discussed by the teams. Again, three main sticking points. That was just one example to the discussions that are ongoing.
Partial or gradual withdrawal of Israeli forces from the Philadelphia corridor, not a complete withdrawal in the first stage. As Prime Minister Netanyahu says, is off the table. And we should note, Doron, in this regard, interesting visit today by the Chief of Staff of the Egyptian military to the Egypt-Gaza border. That's the other side, of course, of the Philadelphia corridor, maybe indicating the U.S. is trying to work with the Egyptians to come up with a formula to answer some of that security questions about arms smuggling from Sinai that Israel is so concerned about.
We should know that the Egyptians are clearly not satisfied with what the way Netanyahu puts the issue of the Philadelphia corridors. If they are to be blamed for all the smuggling, they insist that some of the tunnels were closed. Whatever the facts can be still open, and of course we have to keep it. But putting the Philadelphia corridor in such a fashion as an obstacle to the deal, that's the issue. And now this hair splitting between the east, the west, or the Rafah crossing might help the case, and also hair splitting the two stages, because it seems that Netanyahu was hinting that maybe in the second stage we can withdraw in a limited fashion from the Philadelphia corridor and so on. But I think the crude picture is this. The Americans are going to put an offer on the table. This is the doubling of Biden is doubling his bet. And I think, if I would suggest that we have to be in sync with the U.S. If the offer is relatively satisfactory, we should go with the U.S., but then they would have to bring Hamas to the...
Right, and we heard, of course, what Hamas does publicly and what it does privately are usually different things, but we don't know that Hamas is ready to make even any kind of concessions.
So the best strategy, play with our coalition partner, play with whatever would be offered, and see what's next.
And if the blame falls, let it fall on Hamas from Washington's side, of course. Exactly. And sort of staying on the subject, the United Nations has discussed Israel's offensive against Hamas countless times since October 7th, but the Security Council has never held an official discussion on the situation of the Israeli hostages in Gaza until now, when it finally did so at the request of Israel's ambassador. Again, our senior correspondent Bianca Zanini with the story.
The United Nations Security Council is repeating its call for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza.
Allow me to restate that hostages must be released, civilians must be protected, and their essential needs must be met. This Council and all member states must use their influence to ensure compliance, including by exerting diplomatic and other pressure, and cooperating in pursuing accountability.
During the meeting, convened at the request of Israel, the Council discussed the issue of the Israeli hostages held in Gaza, which had not been put on the agenda since they were kidnapped on October 7th. Members heard stories of child hostages still held by Hamas.
Children were butchered in their houses, butchered, shot, burned, choked, butchered. It took 50 days and more, 50 days in which young children were kept in captivity, kept in complete silence. They were not allowed to cry, not allowed to laugh, not even allowed to stand up. They hardly ate, kept every bite of bread, moved from place to place in the middle of the night, horrified. When they arrived, they did not look like children. They looked like shadows of children. No impressions on their faces. They were not happy. They were not crying. They were mostly very, very silent. Questions like, are we allowed to look out the window? May I step out of bed? Are we safe here? Were repeatedly asked.
Israel's ambassador to the UN called on the Council to condemn Hamas.
Since October 7th, the Security Council has passed 4 resolutions with no condemnation of Hamas for their crimes. Meanwhile, the General Assembly has passed 2 resolutions. Hamas is never even mentioned in either resolution. They vaguely mention the release of those held captive, but fail to identify the Hamas monsters who took them.
The 6 hostages killed this weekend were executed at the same time negotiators were discussing the names of individuals to be released in a ceasefire deal, from its massacre of 1,200 people to its weaponization of sexual violence. These latest murders confirm that Hamas is a terrorist organization. I know some members of this council won't acknowledge that, but that's the simple truth.
The Council insisted on also hearing the stories of Palestinian children. The Palestinian representative to the UN used the meeting to accuse Israel of launching a full-fledged war against the Palestinian people.
From genocide to apartheid, Israel is showing the world its willingness and readiness to use the most despicable means to achieve its colonial aims. Disposition, displacement, devastation, destruction, death. That is what it has been inflicting on Palestinians for decades.
The Israeli ambassador called on the Security Council to reach a resolution.
About time the UN discussed the hostages. Some might say too little, too late. Moving on, Operation Summer Camp. The name sounds benign, even pleasant, but the reality is far from that. It is actually the name of the biggest IDF offensive against terror groups in the West Bank for years. It's gone on over a week now, with Israeli forces battling Palestinian gunmen in and around such hotbed cities as Tulkarem and Jenin, combating Iranian-backed and supplied militant groups. Jody Notelevitz looks at the latest developments.
Quote, mowing the lawn is how Israel Defense Minister Yoav Gallant described the IDF's activities in its West Bank operation dubbed Summer Camp as it reaches its 9th day. Speaking on Wednesday, Gallant added that in order to prevent terror, its roots would eventually need to be pulled too.
The resurgence of car bombs in the West Bank and also inside Israel, and the continuation of this, of shooting everywhere, these are things that need to be brought to an end.
The ongoing major terror operation in the West Bank began at the end of August with raids on Jenin, Tulkarem, and the Farah camp near Tubas. Its goal being dismantling Iran-backed Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad terror networks. So far, more than 30 terrorists have been eliminated, including the son of notorious terrorist Zakaria Zubeidi and other gunmen in a drone strike early Thursday morning in the city of Tubas. Gallant ordered these targeted airstrikes by the Israeli Air Force in places where he believed there was a threat to soldiers. The IDF has said it is working to uncover explosive devices planted along the roads and has subsequently released footage of the demolition of a bomb-making lab, as well as the neutralization of bombs and explosive devices. The fighting forcing residents to huddle in their homes, only emerging for necessities.
The situation in the areas which are under siege is bad. The Israeli army is preventing food, water, ambulances, and journalists from reaching these besieged areas.
Israeli military officials says an operation of this scale is necessary to curb recent attacks against Israeli civilians that have become more sophisticated and deadly.
They're on mowing the grass, but grass grows back. And we know the source here. We heard the defense minister talk about the need to stop these Iranian IEDs, advanced explosive devices, roadside, being smuggled into the West Bank, and Israel could attack these militant cells there. But again, it seems something of a temporary solution in this regard.
Yeah, it's interesting when you see those pictures and images, the audience might think it's Gaza. It shows you the intensity of the fighting there. It's not, if not for the topography that is, of course, different. So the intensity of the fight there in northern Samaria, and we had a few incidents early in this week in Judah, in Hebron, which is to the south. But northern Samaria, there's no control of the Palestinian Authority. There's the smuggling of weaponry from our eastern border with Jordan. So we have Jenin, we have Tulkarem, we have Tubas. Nablus is in the center of this triangle. This is a hub of terrorism, and we have to dismantle it, because otherwise it would, of course, we might meet it in Tel Aviv in whatever capacities of suicide bomber.
Well, we almost did,
and
a couple of weeks ago.
Exactly.
Which is definitely
we have no other option but to try to dismantle
the needs for it. Yeah, West Bank, unfortunately, heating up here.
Yeah.
Well, we are going to go to north of Israel now. We usually, and there were some air raid sirens there today. We've seen some protests by residents about the IDF failing to take measures that would allow enough security for them, the over 60,000 people, to return their homes. But people up north are also concerned about the hostages. Let's go to our correspondent, Zach Anders. He's at the Rosh Pina Junction there. And Zach, what's going on there?
Hi, Kalev. Good evening. Yeah, we're looking at a protest here that's not blocking the road. The crosswalk sign will come on. The protesters will enter into the crosswalk, stay there, and then leave when the light goes off, and they'll allow traffic to flow again. So this is as much of a protest as you hear in the north to try and call attention to the plight of the hostages, and of course is mirroring what we're seeing in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and other areas throughout the country. But again, here a pretty sizable demonstration of about 100 people here in the north. As we're tracking the cross-border fire today, Hezbollah has claimed responsibility for 5 attacks. We don't have any reports of casualties or reports of any significant damage as a result of these attacks. And Hezbollah has announced an additional fatality within their ranks, but this was believed to have been from an event, IDF activity in southern Lebanon yesterday. Now, we've spoken to one of the protesters, woman Amy, that lives in the Golan. She had some very pointed things to say, and again, encapsulates her feelings, being a resident of the north, but also seeing what's been taking place throughout her country. Here's what she had to say.
Literally, up here in the north, our area is burning, right? We have drones and missiles that are being fired all the time. And when they fall, there's fire starting. And the whole area here gets ringed with fire. And so if you just take that as a metaphor for the whole country burning and for the hearts of the hostage families burning, that is what is happening. And so I think that, you know, when we wake up and it's a reality for us every day to be living with security alerts, we feel that. And if I have this opportunity to say it publicly, I will say that I feel so guilty for being apathetic to what the people in the south, in the southern Negev, were going through for years.
So, Kalev, we hear from her after the interview was over. You know, I asked, do you have confidence, or rather, what's your level of confidence if you feel that the ability to get a deal done by this prime minister, by this current government, is nil, that there's not going to be a deal under this current government? Do you have any confidence that there can be a security resolution for you, for the residents here in the north? She said, of course not. We don't have any confidence that this is going to take shape under a Netanyahu administration, and that if a conflict was to, a full-scale conflict with Hezbollah was to break out here, that there would be a very serious widespread devastation for people that live here in the north. And they've already already faced, of course, being evacuated, being pulled away from their homes, 60,000 plus now for 11 months. So the emotions running high here, the protest dying down. It was only supposed to be here for about an hour. And again, it's not blocking the road. This is just, again, a demonstration to try and get every one of these drivers to think about and to be aware, be present with what's taking shape, and mirrors what we're seeing throughout the country. But again, something we don't always see in the north, given that a lot of these people aren't in the north. A lot of these people evacuated, but there's still protests here as well.
All right, Zach Anders there at the Rosh Pinah intersection in northern Israel. And we should note, Doron, that's sort of south of the area that has been evacuated. Kiryat Shmona, down that road, has been evacuated. So there are some people in the immediate area. And that, as that woman said, she's from the Golan, which initially had not been, in the earlier months of the conflict, had not been targeted that much by Hezbollah, but increasingly seems to be coming in the crosshairs of it. So you can understand their frustration, both of the situation of those concerned about hostages and about their security situation, especially in the Golan now.
Yeah, she's from Lavot Bashan, and she puts it very nicely, very
appropriately.
Pointed, because those burns that we have in the Galilee and those fire, it's the way she, in analogy and metaphor, she talked about the hearts of the families of the hostages. It's really, they can touch our hearts. It's very impressive that they do this thing. And of course, we know that the two arenas are connected. If there's a hostage deal, we do remember if there's a hostage deal, when there's a ceasefire, there might be a ceasefire in the north, and then there might be some diplomatic venue that would push Hezbollah. This is the old narrative that America was pushing, that the U.S. were pushing, and I hope it's still available. We'll see if there would be a hostage deal.
Right, but we actually haven't heard that much from the U.S. on that particular connection, Aria, maybe reflecting in some part failure, despite repeated efforts, for example, of Amos Hochstein, the U.S. envoy, to get Hezbollah to make some kind of concessions, even if there would be a ceasefire in Gaza.
Yeah, if we talk about stalled diplomatic efforts for Gaza ceasefire, so as far as the diplomatic efforts for the northern border are concerned, those are pretty much non-existent. They lie in the shoulders pretty much of Amos Hochstein, as you mentioned, a special U.S. envoy, but that hasn't really led anywhere. And the Israeli government is really vague regarding its plans regarding the north, and we got a very good illustration to that earlier this week in Prime Minister Netanyahu's press conference, when he was asked a question by I-24 News' own Owen Alterman, asked him, is there a timetable? Can you tell the residents of the north when they'll return? He says, we know, but we won't say. Basically saying that we don't really know when they will return safely, and so in the absence of that solution, the residents of the north, they're up in the air.
All right, and again, the failure of diplomacy is because the answer is not in Lebanon, it's in Iran for what happens in the north. Doron Avital, Ariel Osran, please stay with us. We are going out for a brief break, but we'll be back with more in a few minutes.
Shalom. ¿Qué me trae por aquí? La necesidad impostergable de 600 millones de hispanoparlantes que ahora necesitan escuchar el mensaje judío e israelí en tiempos difíciles. ¿Cómo lograrlo? Cuento con ustedes para continuar llevando a lo más alto del mundo mediático una inquebrantable diplomacia pública al servicio de la verdad sin concesión alguna.
This broadcast is brought to you by Israel Bonds, the most direct and impactful way to support Israel. Invest now at israelbonds.com. This broadcast is brought to you by Israel Bonds, the most direct and impactful way to support Israel. Invest now at israelbonds.com.
Welcome back to the rundown. Well, Israelis are unfortunately no strangers to terrorist attacks, and the German city of Munich is an especially sore point, of course, given the Black September terrorist attack on Israeli athletes at the 1972 Olympics. So this morning, when German police spotted an armed suspect close to the city's Israeli consulate, they took action. Here's more on that from Emmanuel Honorat.
52 years later, and it seems like the Israeli victims of the Munich massacre in 1972 still can't rest in peace. On the Memorial Day marking the assassination of 11 Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympic Games, German policemen shot and killed an armed man in the area of the Israeli consulate in Munich.
Around 9 a.m., a person was sighted who handled a long weapon. Police officers noticed this. An exchange of fire ensued with this person. We now know that the person died during this exchange of fire. Officers were able to stop the person within this area, and we currently have no information that there could be other people who were injured.
Given the Memorial Day dedicated to the victims of the Munich massacre, the Israeli consulate was closed, but with heightened emotions connected to Israel's war in Gaza, German police took extra precautions.
Special units are currently looking into the area of the perpetrator and a vehicle possibly connected to the perpetrator in order to find out whether there might be any booby traps, but so far we have not encountered any. The investigation is underway.
Israeli President Isaac Herzog took to X to express shared condemnation and horror with the German President Steinmeier. 52 years ago, the Munich massacre changed how the world thinks of terrorism, and yet 52 years later, the memory of the victims is also tainted, with 101 hostages still being held in Gaza. At 4:10 a.m. on the 5th of September 1972, members of the Black September terror group, linked to the Palestine Liberation Organization, entered Munich's Olympic Village, armed with rifles and Kalashnikovs. The mission of the group was to hold the Israeli Olympic team hostage in order to demand the release of 236 prisoners. The attack lasted about 20 hours, with the mission failing, but still managing to kill 11 Israeli athletes. With 101 hostages still being held hostage by Hamas in Gaza, it's difficult to ignore the echoes of the past.
Well, from all, let's go to I-24 News' European correspondent, Polina Garayev in Berlin. And Polina, of course, this incident raises some very horrible, tragic memories for us here in Israel. But I imagine also for Germany as well, a dark chapter in that country's history. So how is this news being received there?
Well, of course, the location of today's shooting attack carries great symbolism, of course, to Israelis, but also to Germans. The museum that is nearby the Israeli consulate that is devoted to documenting the horrors of the Nazi era has also been decided demanded much security. It's opened in 2015 on the site of the former headquarters of the Nazi Party. It's a very sensitive site for Germans as well. And of course, the Israeli consulate is under constant police security that, of course, was also increased today, given the anniversary. It is also should be mentioned that if indeed reports of an Islamist motivation behind today's attack are confirmed, we're seeing the second Islamist terror attack on German soil in a matter of weeks. And this is, of course, a matter of great concern for authorities here.
Right, and I'm curious because you mentioned that other recent incident. We are seeing this incidents involving young Muslim men or Islamists, extremists, and of course, how does that add to the discourse in Germany? I know this is a major issue, of course, that, for example, is fueling the rise of one of the far-right parties there, the AfD.
Absolutely. The government has come under attack from within, but also from the opposition, as particularly from the far-right party Alternative for Germany, the AfD, that has recently, just this past Sunday, made significant gains, even winning its first regional elections here in Germany. And they, as also many others, I should mention, are criticizing the government for not being tough enough on domestic security, which is why the government is just now proposed a new plan, several steps meant to increase domestic security and tackle the topic of migration. That plan is now being discussed by politicians across the political spectrum here in Germany. But still, there any decisions, any steps been implemented, but already following the recent terror attacks in Solingen involving a knife, we've seen measures being proposed to, for example, tackle specifically knife violence that has been on the rise in Germany for several years, and last year reached an all-time high. So while other steps might be difficult to implement, Germany is now working on limiting the size of the knives that are permitted to be carried in public. This is how Germany is responding, first and foremost, to the attack that it's seen 2 weeks ago. When this attack today was carried on with a rifle, an antique rifle that a bayonet was attached to. You don't really see those too often here on the streets. So the same measures would not apply, and it remains to be seen how the government decides to tackle or respond to this particular attack, especially since, according to latest police data, the attacker actually came from Austria. He crossed the border and targeted what seemed apparently, or at least according to the latest development is in the investigation, he targeted the Israeli consulate, intending to commit a terror attack. He managed to cross the border after, according to at least media reports, being known to authorities there is a suspected Islamist. We're probably going to see a lot of discourse regarding border security and whether Germany should implement more control there.
All right, that makes sense. I'm not sure a limiting knife sale or not, knife sizes is going to have much impact in that regard. Polina Garayev in Berlin, thank you for that. And still with us, Doron Avital, Ariel Osron. And Ariel, we don't know the background of this young man, if this was a lone wolf or he might have had other connections. But I think we should keep in mind the continuing threats from Iran in response, of course, to the elimination of Ismail Haniyeh. Iran threatening, making threats not only at targets here in Israel, but as Israeli targets, potentially Jewish targets abroad, including in Europe.
Israel is not short of threats against it, and also Jewish elements around the world. But I think this better ties to calls coming out from Hamas, what we heard last week, Khaled Mashal, senior Hamas official, the former leader of Hamas, calling for the resurgence of suicide attacks around the world, abroad, not just in the West Bank and inside Israel, and a call that ISIS joined on to just over the weekend in its weekly newsletter, so to speak, a Naba. They wrote an opinion piece that called for attacks against Jews, against Christians, but also specifically against Jews around the world, in Europe, in response to Israel's war against Hamas in Gaza. This is a linkage that we're not used to seeing, that obviously many Islamist elements do cooperate or find themselves like-minded, but the fact that ISIS is calling for attacks against Jews in response to what is happening in Gaza that we haven't seen until now, and that just illustrates illustrates how these genocidal anti-Semitic organizations, they don't need a reason to incite for terrorism, but they do take advantage of current events, of current affairs, to try and incite these lone terrorists, these individuals who do have sentiment of hatred towards Jews, towards Israelis, to carry out attacks. Often these elements do carry out attacks, and then after the fact, ISIS claims responsibility for them. So we're seeing this international linkage of global jihad coming into effect in the midst of this ongoing war in Gaza. And so we see not only the threats from Iran, but calls from Hamas to carry out attacks abroad, as well as ISIS to attack Jews abroad.
Yeah, perhaps a misnomer to use the phrase lone wolf or lone terrorist, because there's always that structure of incitement at the very least that is behind the brief.
And this is a new linkage, I mean, because ISIS, as the audience knows, those are Sunnite, Iran, and they're not Iran, of course, and ISIS are enemies, and then they joined the fray. And we also had a few incidents of ISIS-motivated attacks within Israel, even in the Arab society. We should look also for that. And of course, Israel institutions and Jewish institutions abroad are a target, and I think we take it's one of the objectives of the Shabak or the internal security forces to make sure that we are protected also abroad. It's another front. Many fronts on our plate.
Thankfully, this incident ended without any injury to anyone. Well, let's turn now to the U.S. presidential election, where divisions over support for Israel, or perhaps the perceived lack of support, continues to be a source of debate between Republicans and Democrats. The GOP candidates have been hammering the Biden administration, in particular Vice President Kamala Harris, with charges of failing to sufficiently back Israel in a time of war. It's an issue that plays well to the GOP's evangelical base and perhaps gives the Trump-Vance ticket some hopes of picking up a few Jewish votes. Here's the Ohio Senator GOP VP candidate J.D. Vance speaking just yesterday in Arizona.
So if you want to empower Israel and you want to allow America to focus on China, allow the Israelis to focus on Iran, right? Let them finish this war. Let them get it over as quickly as possible, destroy Hamas as a fighting force, and then they can figure out what to do from there. America has got to make it easier for our allies to finish this war. Kamala Harris wants to prolong it. Doesn't make an ounce of sense.
Well, Jewish Republicans are gathering, the Republican Jewish Coalition gathering this week in Las Vegas for their annual convention, and our senior U.S. correspondent Mike Wagenheim is there. And Mike, I think that RJCs must be feeling particularly relevant right now in this election cycle.
No doubt whatsoever. They're trying to hammer home the point that the Republican Party is the only choice for pro-Israel American Jews. It's part of their messaging. It's been that way for quite some time, but now essentially trying to beat the horse till it's dead and gone here. We expect to hear from former President Donald Trump shortly via satellite. Speaker of the House Mike Johnson spoke earlier today. Yesterday, reporters got to have a brief chat with the chairman of the Republican National Committee, Michael Whatley. And during that chat, I asked him directly, listen, Trump and other high-level Republican officials are making the case that American Jews who continue to vote Democrat are crazy. They're nuts. They're Meshuggah. Does Whatley, the head of the Republican National Committee, agree with that sentiment? Here was his answer to us.
I think that what we see in this election cycle, it comes down to a question of strength versus weakness, and our ability to protect American interests at home and abroad, as well as the interests of our allies like Israel. There is no question. That is why Donald Trump is winning on that issue in every single poll where they're polling it, as well as whether we're going to have a strong economy or a strong southern border.
We'll generously consider that a non-answer to the question, Kalev. By the way, Senator Rick Scott of Florida told the RJC Summit audience yesterday that Kamala Harris is essentially using Doug Emhoff's Jewishness, her husband's Jewishness, as a cover of sorts to continue to court the votes of anti-Semites. Strong accusation there from Senator Rick Scott. Now, we got to speak earlier this morning with Senator Joni Ernst from Iowa, a member of the Abraham Accords caucus within the Capitol. Of course, when we hear from Donald Trump a little bit later today. He'll be touting the Abraham Accords as one of his bona fide pro-Israel accomplishments. We asked Senator Ernst, who just came back from a congressional delegation from the Middle East. She visited Israel, Saudi Arabia, where she met with the Crown Prince. She visited Egypt, Qatar, and other relevant players in the Middle East. And we asked her whether there is still an opportunity for normalization to move forward, given the divergent interest of all those countries and all those leaders that she just visited with. Here's the answer from Senator Joni Ernst of Iowa.
All of the affected parties are very far apart right now, but I do feel that there is room for American leadership. We need strong leadership to bring these parties to the table and really talk about what's going on and how to find that path forward. There's going to be a lot of negotiation here, but unfortunately what we see right now is a very weak Biden-Harris administration, and they're sending mixed messages to the Middle East, and it's confusing all of those leaders. They're not sure where their alliances are. Is it with Israel? Is it with Iran? So we really don't know, and they don't know. And if they don't know, they will not be able to find a path forward.
Kalev, it's going to be really interesting. You know, you always put your money where your mouth is. Where the money from the Republican Jewish Coalition and its counterparts on the Democratic side go in these final weeks leading up to the election. Remember, it's not just about the presidency. There are a number of Senate candidates speaking here in Las Vegas this week, including, ironically enough, Carrie Lake from Arizona, who's been accused of anti-Semitic comments and leanings herself. Where in those House and Senate races is the money really going to be focused here? It's not just about the White House, but who controls the House and the Senate as well, and some critical races being discussed here in Las Vegas over these few days at the RJC Summit.
Right, and we should note, speaking of Republican donors, it's happening at the Venetian. Miriam Adelson, of course, a major donor, as was her late husband, Sheldon Adelson, to the Republican Party, and that's certainly a factor. But, Mike, 4 years ago, for example, the RJC could have had there at the convention Mike Pence, someone who they really felt was someone who would give full-hearted support to Israel. Early we played that comment by J.D. Vance, the current vice presidential candidate, speaking about support for Israel, maybe not coincidentally right before this convention, but there is a feeling for some that he represents more of the so-called isolationist wing of the party that might be verbally supportive of Israel, but when it comes to, for example, military aid packages, more hesitant. And that question is if those Republican Jews feel as comfortable with this ticket now as, for example, they might have 4 years ago.
Yeah, you know, I think the same case could have been made to oppose Donald Trump on those same foreign policy grounds, that he's an isolationist, America firstist, that he wants to not get involved in foreign affairs to the greatest extent possible. And yet, the accomplishments on the Israel front, the policy initiatives on the Israel front with the Abraham Accords, with the moving of the embassy, which he was warned against, with the recognition of the Golan Heights. So I think Republicans can make the case that even if you are an isolationist in the vein of J.D. Vance, that there still can be that projection made for a support of Israel through thick and thin. I think Trump kind of, according to Republicans, set the standard, and there's no reason that with a Trump-Vance ticket that support for Israel would necessarily drop off, even if it will be classified as an isolationist policy going forward. That's at least the case that Republicans are trying to make.
All right, we'll see how much that convinces it and whether Republicans can. Of course, the majority of Jews will vote Democrat on domestic issues. I think that's pretty much a fact. But how much can the Trump-Vance ticket eat into that traditional base of support for the Democrats? Mike Wagenheim there at the RJC in Las Vegas. Thank you for that, Mike. And Doron, I should is looking from the perspective of Israel, there has to be satisfaction that the Republican Party, that historically at one time wasn't very supportive of Israel, it's now such a key part of the Republican Party identification. On the other hand, seeing Israel, support for Israel become an issue of partisan bickering in the U.S. is something perhaps less less approved in Jerusalem.
For sure, from our perspective, I would say we shouldn't play partisan U.S. politics. Israel is a sovereign state, and we play with the sovereign empire, which is the US. But of course, Netanyahu took a different direction, and this has really pulled us into this partisan US game. It's interesting that the Republicans, the 90s, you think Bush the father and Baker, they were very tough on Israel in terms of guarantees and financial and trying to push it in the line that they were thinking about. Vance made an interesting observation. He was linking China with Iran, which they are linked, of course, and then he was portraying it as if we are fighting Iran, they will fight China, in the same sense that the small devil and the big devil, the way Iran would look at Israel and the US. It's an interesting interesting remark that he made. And another insight is very important. We mentioned the Abraham Accords, okay? But we have to remember that the Biden corridor, the Biden doctrine, and next, whatever they will call it next, either Harris or Trump, this is the next floor on top of the Abraham Accords.
Right, a military accord.
No, the Saudi Arabia, the normalization, the possible, and the whole corridor. So basically, it is the two sides, whoever would win, I think this would be the policy that they would take in terms of Saudi Arabia in this corridor. And it's important for the Israelis to note, because it might, on the two sides, might require from us some concession in the Palestinian front. So we have to take it seriously. Whatever, I mean, in a few months.
I think we will have to get to that point. We're still a ways off.
Exactly.
Doron Avital, Ariel Osran, thank you for joining us. Now, the north of Israel, of course, has been in turmoil over much of the past year as it experiences heavy fire from Hezbollah attacks. And as we noted, most residents in the north in that border area have had to evacuate their homes. But at one vineyard in the Upper Galilee, volunteers say harvesting grapes there is a needed distraction from the war. More in this report from our correspondent Pierre Klosch-Hendler and Jody Notelevitz.
First, thank you for showing up in your trouble and work. And secondly, let's raise a glass now to Petit Verdot. This is what we got today. A wonderful vintage, so cheers everyone and lots of health.
With the dawn and the evaporation of the autumn dew, we have reached the Upper Galilee, near the border with Lebanon. That's where the vineyard of Rami Naaman, the winemaker, is, in a hidden area of about 3 acres.
Was your vineyard damaged by the shelling at all?
No. There are other vineyards, the other side of the ridge, where there was serious damage. In the vineyards, also fields that burned all around and caused the vines to dry up. But fortunately, it didn't come to that. We are hidden here from every direction.
Today is the last day of the grape of the Petit Verdot variety, the perpendicular in the 4 rows.
The decision on the harvest date. It is one of the most important decisions. We check 3 things. One is sugar, which increases towards the end. The second is acidity that goes up and down, and you look for the best situation between them. And the last thing is the most wonderful thing. It's called phenolic ripeness. Phenols are the taste and smell substances that come out of the grape, and you determine this according to your taste.
So how do you do it? Do you smell the grape?
These weeks, I constantly taste the grapes and say, okay, the flavors aren't there yet. Not there yet, not there yet now. This is the last vintage. I hope next harvest will be under more reasonable conditions. Petit Verdot ages splendidly. I started making Petit Verdot Grand Reserve in 2008, and it's aged for 2 years in a barrel. It's already won several awards, including this year, it won a gold medal. Petit Verdot has its own qualities and amazing color. It's deep, and the taste, I call it a dark taste. Chanterelle flavor and forest mushrooms. This strain is not native to France. It probably came here from the Middle East. I don't know exactly where. Anyway, it's very, very good here. In France, they use it just as a spice. In addition to the mixture here, I was the first who made a varietal wine from it in 2006.
When I see these little grapes, it reminds me of caviar.
Right. It's nature's caviar, totally, especially since the Petit Verdot is the smallest grape.
The place allows escape from an unusual situation that became a routine. Although for a few days it was calm here, everything, of course, is relative. A fragile calm that hints at what is to come. No one here is deluding themselves. The war in the north is not over. All in all, life is good. Grapes, wine, caviar.
Do you like wine?
No. Father and daughter, Tomer and Aya, came from Emek Hula to volunteer with Rami, not for the first time. Aya finished her regular military service in February and went straight to the reserves until the start of summer. She wants to study medicine, but is waiting for the next call up. A lot of dreams of this young generation have become stuck.
Contributing as much as possible helps you cope with the feeling of helplessness that this situation creates. But sitting at home and living this reality does not help anyone, because otherwise it's really easy to sink into depression and also stress.
Wine sanctifies life and the pleasures of life. That's known. Maybe the wine will allow thoughts to stay in the head, while the memory of the year's events leaves a stain as red as wine on the soul, but only for a moment. Aya wants to travel.
We'll start in Spain. Then we will move on to France, Switzerland, Austria, Slovakia, Italy, somewhere there.
Where wine is produced or not?
Yes.
As the sun rises through the vine leaves, intimate small talk breaks out at a faster pace. Conversations about the north.
זה פחות מדקה, יותר מדקה. לא, פחות מדקה, 20-30 שניות להגיע. כן, זהו, לכן אני שואלת אם אתם עומדים בזה. אני רוצה להאמין שכן, אבל לא יודע, לא פתחתי שעון משנה מה נעשה?
141 neat boxes in 4 rows of 7x5 and 6 more buckets full. In total, approximately 7,000 bottles. It was a fruitful winter for Petit Verdot. Just the right amount of cold, rainy for long periods. Rami has a special affection for the wine he invented, the Babe Merlot, named after Bob Marley.
Well, when do we drink already?
Pierre looks like he was enjoying himself there. You have the grapes of wrath, but I think those are pretty much the opposite of that. That ends our program for today. Of course, you continue to follow I-24 News on our website and our various social media platforms. I'll end the program when I get the chance to wish that the hostages be returned home safe and sound as soon as possible in any way possible. Thank you for watching, and if you get the chance, catch the rundown.